Jimmy, what's up, man? It's another episode of Everyday Gospel, and today I got my brother Jimmy Paul here. How you doing, bro?
Hey, what's up, Gav? What's going on, New Springs? Once again, it's good to see you, man.
Yeah.
Nice hat, bro. That's up high, too. What kind of hat is it?
See, here,
God, put it backwards, bro. Just put it back around. I can't keep looking at this. Looney Tunes, Disney stuff.
That's Batman, man. That's the Dark Knight.
No, I'm sorry. DC. Well, I know. We've been talking the Dark Knight with my boys lately.
You better recognize, man. He keeps the streets safe. This is the OG detective, Batman.
Oh, so cool, man.
I've been discovering on New Era Cap, the company. They've got all these different comic book character hats and all that stuff. That's me all day, because I don't get a haircut every 2 weeks. Then my hair looks like nonsense, and that actually leads us into a little bit of what we're going to talk about. So I haven't gone to the barber because the COVID cases in Florida are crazy yet again, and I don't need some dude breathing on my neck when there's a pandemic out there. So you and I both, we've seen lots of we watch the news, follow social media, talk to people, and this is surprisingly to me such a polarizing issue. And what I mean by that is we've really politicized the coronavirus. COVID-19 is a political issue.
Yeah.
There's a liberal view and there's a conservative view, and that has really struck me as odd. What are some of your thoughts about that?
Yeah. No, I think, if we're talking everyday gospel today, we're talking about the pandemic, particularly, and especially we're here in South Florida. The coronavirus, COVID-19, and the pandemic that faces us. We see the cases are increasing, maybe in light of testing, maybe not. But like you said, everybody feels free to have an opinion on it, and more so, they've used it to politicize agendas, maybe beliefs, to some extent. And I don't mind. I think, everybody's entitled to their thoughts as it pertains to certain things. But I think what's happened is we actually lose sight of the reality that it is a pandemic. If you got one death or if you got 500 million deaths, life is still supremely important. And so for me, dude, I walk very cautiously into those circles, and part of me gets upset whichever way anybody wants to swing it, because still when I see those numbers and when I see new cases, and me being a fireman, I see this stuff on the regular. So I know hospitals are filling up. It's not just a matter of statistics.
Personally affected. Like, we know people who.
Well, yeah, we know good buddies of ours right now that we're praying for and lost people, lost family members as a result of the virus. And I have my own families right now. I'm in it. I get to face it, or calls coming in. And so, man, it hurts me to some extent to know that that we're politicizing something that that God stands over, and that may warrant us to consider our own thoughts, maybe our theology. So this thing should cause us to consider God, number one, and look to Him instead of very quickly, forming opinions that are very much full of error. We all have them, and they're all full of error. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So I mean, we want to be biblically informed about everything, right? And I think there's a common struggle for the Christian in applying my faith to just everyday circumstances, right? So I believe, having a solid knowledge of God, a solid knowledge of His Word is going to help me navigate, how do I handle what comes my way. So I know scriptures tell me unapologetically and all over the place that God is sovereign and completely in control. So I know that this virus doesn't come out of left field. I know that it doesn't. It hasn't surprised Him, that there's some unforeseen purpose in its existence. One of those purposes, at least that I do know, is to point to the fact that this is not our home. That heaven's coming, right? The new heavens and the new earth. But I think where people kind of get the rub a little bit, maybe we could chat about this, is there's the correct view that the state, the government, has no right or authority to inform me on my faith, right? If they came out with an edict tomorrow that said Bibles were illegal, you can't read them, you know, good luck with passing that edict in my house, right? You're not going to tell whether or not I can engage with my Lord in the scriptures. So we know government has no rights over our personal faith. And so some have taken the stance that because we're believers and Christ commands us to gather for worship, that the guidelines and the recommendations that we stay at home, that we quarantine or don't gather in large groups, and if we do, wear masks. There are some who are interpreting that as the government trying to impose its authority on the church. I see that a little bit differently, but I wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
No, I think it's important is when we're talking about our kind of the government, like you said, Gad, and democracy on certain levels. We're trying to consider, you know, what's the role of government as it pertains to faith. And like you say, we never want our faith to be infringed upon by government, where we're not expressing ourselves, worshiping ourselves as we see fit according to God and His Word.
Yeah.
And so there's a political kind of sphere to this. You know, what does this actually look like? How do you restrict? How do you protect the people? And what's our viewpoints on that? I think we can have it. I think we can engage in that conversation when we want to. But my problem is that it teeters very quickly to conversation to then being dogma or a dogmatic doctrinal position. And you very quickly can formulate your ecclesiology or your thoughts about church. You can formulate your missiology, your theology, all your doctrines then that you would associate with God that should be governed biblically, especially with neighbor, community. You allow some of the political thought processes and maybe democratic kind of virtues to seep into maybe a biblical, you know, framework where maybe they're not warranted. So for me, when I think about worship, for example, you know, Sunday worship, it's a command, it's a rhythm that we gather on Sunday worship. But then at times, you know, when you look at church history, the church faced persecution and then they were scattered. I wrote an article at this early on in this pandemic. The church was scattered from, you know, from the place of Christ's crucifixion and then His ascension, but they were then scattered abroad. And persecution and an opposing governmental authority served as God's instrument for His people to fulfill their continuing mission and God's continuing mission of redemption. And it came about through persecution against the church. So the church wasn't like, yo, we're doing this, we're coming together tight. No, God's like, yo, boom, spread out. I want to send my gospel and my witness out. I got other purposes here, and I'm going to use the instrument of a opposing, persecuting government to accomplish it. Which is amazing when you look at Acts and you see God's Spirit, His Spirit, you know, the propelling force of that, the gospel then extending out through that. But it wasn't like, yo, we're coming back. Like God was doing a work and He was using governments kind of to accomplish that. So God stands over this all. And so part of my framework when I think of ecclesiology or just worship, should we worship? Should we not? I think a little bit through the lens of Acts. And part of me sees God's mission, His hand over, you know, a pandemic that we don't control. It's under the control of God. You know, and I think we should all consider that before maybe thinking too strong. We know what time it is. You know what I mean?
Well, you know what, I like how you frame that theologically. You know, looking at Acts is a good spot. I think it's really important for us to understand what time period we're in redemptive history. So what I mean by that is not just we're in 2020 in a technological age facing a pandemic. I mean, in the story of God and His redemption of the world, where are we? The closest parallel I can think of is the wilderness wanderings, right? So here's where I'm coming from with that is you have Israel in the Old Testament who's in slavery, they're in bondage to Egypt. More times than not, Paul makes that kind of connection in the New Testament to say that we're in slavery, we're in bondage to sin. And what Christ does is he sets us free. So the moment that happens, Jesus Christ sets us free from the sin, from slavery to sin on the cross, and then his resurrection. Well, what happens after the Israelites were set free from Egypt? Well, they've got to wander in the wilderness before they reach the promised land, right?
Yeah.
We're not at the promised land. This is kind of our new covenant wilderness. And as the as the Israelites were traveling, there were raiders, there were marauders, there were other nations that were constantly beating at them. And it was very much, if you read Exodus chapter 12, for example, I think it's verse 11, where God instructs Moses to tell the people, when you eat this Passover meal, I want you to eat it in haste. Pack your bags, have your belt tied, have your shoes on. You're moving. You have not arrived in the promised land yet. And that's where we are. We're on mission for the gospel. We're on mission for Christ. And so I don't know that anyone would articulate it this way and say, we've arrived, I'm saved, I'm in the promised land. But I think practically sometimes we work it out that way. And so because we expect that, the church is supposed to have this special position in society and afforded special governmental rights and, allowed to do as we please because we have this faith, it's kind of an over-realized eschatology. It's kind of like, believing that all of the good things that are promised to us in the end are applicable now. They're just not. We're going to be persecuted, and not saying that the government telling us to wear masks is persecution. If you think that's persecution, you got no idea. This isn't persecution. I think this is more of a love your neighbor aspect.
I think what you point out, Gav, is I think for us at New Springs Church, man, if I could talk, just plain talk with some of my people, some of our friends and family, my faith has been a faith. I think of the Samaritan woman we talk about, where God's seeking worshipers that worship in spirit and in truth. It was neither on this mountain nor on that mountain. And location became a big thing. But the Spirit then is the main character of Acts that births the church. And Christ was the anointed. I'm even thinking Psalm 2 and Psalm 18 that we're reading this week, where Christ would be that anointed king that would come, who would build the house or the Jerusalem, like you're saying, the city. But it was the church. And so like you, though, the church is not fully realized. So we're gathered together. We're under the umbrella of Christ as our king now. But now, as we live and as we worship by spirit and truth, and we're seeking a full city to come. But this time has been, it could be so profitable and refining to us as a church, God's people, Christians for that matter, to think biblically and look at some of these things. Like you're saying, Paul's writings, when he urges us to be reminded that we're not citizens of this world, but rather we're citizens of heaven. That word citizen would be polis. It would be where you would get this concept of political, type of jargon in the Greek. So we're a polis, or our city or our polis would be heaven. It's not here. And so, man, when we're unable to gather, or we're unable to even see maybe Sunday worship as like that climatic event, like in Western Christianity, we're like, well, we got to go to church. And we sometimes are like, well, wait a second, what do we do at church? Why do we worship on the first day when Christ ascended? And then the rest of the week we're then sent out and we're continuing in this mission. We're a people on mission from a place of worship. You know what I mean? We're not a people kind of doing life and then we just gather to worship on the last day. We're a people from worship. We embrace our week on mission. We start Sunday and we then sojourn, and that continual rhythm of worship, work, it finds itself kind of in a rhythm, I think, of us as a community. Like we're hoping for that full worship, that full day of rest that will one day come, whether we see Christ in death or whether he comes again. You know what I mean?
So you're spot on with that. We from worship is where we go and we live out the kind of the implications of the gospel. And one of those implications of the gospel is love your neighbor, right? So I think that's kind of the, how should I then live in this?
That's get practical with it.
How should I then live with? I'm faced with this pandemic. I can't worship in a building with my brothers and sisters. I'm trying to stay connected online as best as I can. And I've got the government telling me that I've got to wear a mask if I want to go to Publix. One of the first passages that comes to my mind is 1 Corinthians chapter 8. And I believe Paul kind of repeats this argument in Romans 14. It could be 1 Corinthians 9, but 8 or 9. And what he's addressing there is there's one group of people who will not eat meat that's been sacrificed to idols. So basically, someone's having a barbecue, they throw the brisket on the smoker, the brisket pops out, everybody's ready to eat, and there's a couple brothers who are at the barbecue who say, I can't eat that because that cow was used to worship a foreign deity, right? And so Paul is amongst some people who say, I cannot eat that meat because of what that meat was initially used for. Paul's argument then is twofold, and I think it speaks to both camps, whether you think wearing a mask is stupid or you think that it's a good idea. He says you have freedom. You're free in Christ, free to live your life. Christ has already set you free. You're not working to earn God's favor anymore. But in that freedom, you're to love and care for your brother. And so you've got elderly folks who are very nervous about their health. You've got people like us where we've got young families. I know what the statistics say, but at the end of the day, I get home, I've got a 2-year-old and I've got a 6-month-old, and I am not bringing home a virus to infect them. And so we've got to be sensible about where people are coming from. Maybe someone's got asthma or has negative health history or just recovered from cancer, and we don't know that. And it feels like a bit of we're lacking the love that we should have if we say it's my right to take this thing off of my face because I don't like the heat being breathed back on myself. Seems like a small thing. Wear the mask, and now you're not causing a brother or sister to stumble. You're putting others before yourself when you do that.
I think that's a great passage. It's 1 Corinthians 8, and then 1 Corinthians 9. Paul gives the personal example. Am I not free to do that? Am I not free to eat anything? Like, what is this food then sacrificed to an idol? Think about that. A false god, food, and presentation says, man, I know I could eat this all day long, but yet he surrenders his rights for the sake of his brother. And then goes so far to say that if you aren't concerned about your brother to some extent with you having all this freedom, you go on sinning, quite plainly, because you're not fulfilling even the law and even God's righteousness, which is to love God and to love neighbor. And so, you make a great point to that end, especially as this plays out, as the pandemic plays out. And that's, our response as believers, I think, are twofold. One, we think about our neighbor in this, and nobody is a Christians are not, you are not an epidemiologist. Like, let me just stop you in your tracks real quick, with your our Google reports that we read, and you're like, ooh, I like this report. I'm going to quote this epidemiologist. You're like, who are you kidding? Like, I graduated from Miami-Dade College, like, okay, I'm pulling it together, but, and our minds are so finite when we think about creator and creature. Like, we have no concept of what really God might be doing in all of this. He stands sovereignly over it, working many things for his will. So our first response, I think, should be a fear before God to say, hey, life is being taken here. Let me prostrate myself before God, number one. And spend some long time there, because as we come before God, I think we get a little bit more silent, which is good for us. We consider our own frailty and our own finiteness. You know what I mean? When you face a pandemic, and we have brothers that have lost people, even now. I think about our other church members that have lost spouses, man. And then we have, we're talking about a child today that's undergoing surgery, a baby in a COVID housed hospital undergoing eye surgery. I'm like, people need to know that God stands over all this, and that Christ is a reigning king, stands over everything, willing, reigning, redeeming, bringing hope, saving, holding, comforting. Like, he can do all this. But I think our thought process is we don't start from a place of God sometimes. Biblically, we start from other narratives. We enter into this conversation from an other narrative, and allow God to kind of lead us a little bit, maybe, and comfort us, maybe.
I think we need that objective focus desperately. We're bathed in a culture that breeds selfishness if you allow it to. You're taught to work hard for yourself, to earn for yourself, to pursue your hopes and dreams, and that's really bled into our expressions of Christianity in earthly ways, where far too many Christians, evangelicals, whatever we want to label ourselves, have this passionate battle for our rights. We got the rights to tax exemption. We got the right to X, Y, and Z. I got the right to not wear a mask. And man, I don't. There's the passage. Man, I can't think of it now. Where Paul's talking. It might be Philippians 3, where Paul's laying out who he was as a Pharisee. But I think in another passage, Paul talks about laying aside his rights. For the sake of the gospel, and that's got to be our motivation. I get it. You're a human being, and your due dignity because you're made in the image of God, and I'll be the first to proclaim that in many situations. But we have to understand the difference of what does it look like for me to fight for my personal rights versus fight for the rights of other people. And if the high ethic in this situation is a human being's right to live, well, then the way I uphold that and love my neighbor well is wear a mask so that I don't perpetuate this virus, in spite of what I think, right? Because you can pull up plenty of articles that will tell you the mask doesn't block anything and it's a hoax and the cases aren't that. You can go find an article to support whatever you want to believe. And people will do that. They'll say, in the name of Christ, I'm not wearing a mask.
Oh, it's so, yes.
I read this article and,
very cautious.
I got to lovingly tell you that, the world thinks you're a jerk when you approach it that way. Just put on the mask, love other people, you get home, you can take it off all day.
I'm thinking, let me think of this. I might even change it up even more. Because I think it's a matter of submission to our authorities as well, which is in complete conjunction to our personal worship to God. So Romans 12 does this, where he goes, I appeal to you by the mercies of God to present your bodies as a sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship, right? Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good, acceptable, and perfect. I love that. I'm always like, man, what is that? By testing, I got to discern what is good, what's the will of God. And then in Romans 13, as he fleshes this out, this worship, offer your bodies as a sacrifice, he says, let every person be subject to the governing authorities. For there's no authority except from God and those that exist that are instituted by God. Now, I granted the argument is at play when the governing authorities restrict our worship and oppression, and we're not allowed to. But I think the early church is a pretty cool example when you think of the persecution that was them. They weren't, they were fleeing, and that authority, they were probably in submission to it to some extent, but then they were fleeing after the fact. I don't know. But here in America, I don't know if our governing authorities are trying to oppress us religiously right now, or if that's the agenda. You can't make, that's a pretty hard dogmatic statement, I think, to make in the face of a global pandemic. And they're just really tough decisions to be made. So I would venture to say what you're saying. I think sometimes our worship is in response to love of God, love of neighbor, care of neighbor, also understanding God's sovereign hand and how he works missiology-wise, and what he wills at times, where he can be worshipped in spirit and in truth for a time, for a setting. We're not here or there, but maybe he's doing something with us, among us, to teach us things. But then more so, I think if our authorities tell us we should wear a mask within 6 feet, I think maybe that may be an authority issue. Maybe our own spirits, our own hearts, maybe it's a good practice to submit, dude. I don't do it, but it's, I'm not the best as a fireman. I rough shoulders, but man, submission is very virtuous, man. There's glory all in it when I see it from people. And I'm just like, I see Jesus because Jesus submitted himself. God submitted himself, in the flesh, submitted himself to be crucified. to some due process that was fake. You know what I mean? It was crazy.
There's kind of a principle there where I think inherent in being a Christian, there's the temptation toward arrogance, right? Because you've been given a new knowledge. We know spiritual things.
Yeah, there's that temptation.
You know what I mean? So we know spiritual things that really are the answer to the world's problems. And when you have that kind of information, that salvation is found in Jesus Christ alone, and here's how it plays out throughout these 66 books. If you're not careful, it puffs up into arrogance. And it's kind of an arrogant position to, go from your 9-to-5 job, sitting in a cubicle, and then arrive at home. And because you're a Christian, you're an expert on pandemics. You're just not, right? So listen to doctors who know what they're talking about, right? And we've heard Christian doctors take that position. Christian doctors say, this is real, take this seriously. So bottom line, I think to kind of wrap this up is we've got to realize the sovereignty of God and his control over this situation, right? He's in absolute control. I think secondly, we need to realize where we are in redemptive history. We're not at the promised land, and so therefore we can expect trouble in many forms, whether it be actual individuals persecuting, or a disease that's running rampant, or fear and anxiety present in my heart. So that's where we are in history. And then third, I think we need to have that love your neighbor ethic, where regardless of what conspiracy theory you think is out there are people who have legitimately died. I know about 8 of them. And there are people who are legitimately struggling with fear and anxiety in this time. And the loving thing for a Christian to do is to either stay home or put on a mask when you go out, because that's
to that, man, as a fireman, we've had cruise ships on staging with dead people and bodies on those cruise ships for weeks, just sitting out there. No cruise ship usually comes back to port with about 10 bodies on it.
Yeah.
You got hospitals now that are inundated now here in Florida. You have what was happening in New York. You have it here. I got people in the hospitals. I'm at hospitals. You'll see it, overwhelmed. So whatever the case may be, we don't know for certain, but I know there are effects. So like Christ would give the analogy, you don't know where the spirit blows. I'm like, just like the wind, you can tell its effects upon a tree. You can't really see it. I think sometimes when we look at some of these evidences that we see in society, especially the personal stories now that we know of and some of this, we should, our first response is, let's pray. Let's pray, man. Let's pray that God would protect us, protect those that we love. Then at the same time, let's get our message clear that we have a deep, abiding hope that deals with suffering, that deals with death, that deals with injustice. I'm going to tell you the reigning king and the just, perfect one that came and died for us, that knows suffering. Like, we have that hope of the gospel that is real, though, tangible for people to allow Christ to minister to them in their homes, in their quiet spaces, by his word when they pray. And it's not maybe covered in lights or sometimes, or maybe it's a way of Christianity that I think God can bring about some real good with his people. And so I hope in my prayers that people, they see God now and they allow God to kind of shape them up, strengthen them with his character. We believe in a God that saves, and we barely know the facets of God when we talk about him.
Yeah.
Sproul used to give this holiness analogy, but like, you think you know God, but let me show you what it's really like. It's like 2 ants, and then we're both looking side by side up to God in these galaxies.
Yeah.
Don't think you're a little bit higher to God. You ain't nowhere near.
Right,
like you ain't nowhere closer to his mind, to some respects, his holiness, his power.
Yeah.
So I consider some of those things when we think about our faith and as a church. And so, man, I think it's wise to consider this pandemic and keep holding together.
Yeah.
Use these technologies like you're saying, and pray for wisdom. We need some wisdom. We need to care for our neighbors though right now too.
You gotta love your neighbors, and it's important. I see some alarming statistics in terms of people just kind of dropping off in terms of faith, not engaging in online services, not engaging in Bible studies. New Springs, don't let that happen to you or anyone who's watching this. It's we live in a society where when you go to school, they try to take care of your body and your mind, but nobody's taking care of your spirit, right? That's what the church exists for. Jesus Christ is going to save your soul, and so we want to stay engaged. Last thing I'll say, guys, is we've got several of these episodes Everyday Gospel. You can catch them on the website, here on Facebook if that's where you're watching it, YouTube. Go back and look at some of the videos. We've talked about racism. We've talked about unity, gospel clarity, all kinds of topics that I think are going to be beneficial to you. And you can watch me rebuke Jimmy when he's wrong. It happens a lot.
You can see me make fun of this Disney stuff I see all the time. I can't even deal. I can't deal.
I'm got a
right
different background. Like every time we film this, I'm a nobody, man. This is like,
I thought you had a sport hat on for a minute. I'm like, all right, let's see what's he rocking right now. And then I'm looking at like an '80s Batman and Robin. I'm like, only Gav.
Adam West Batman.
Only Gav, man. I love it, man.
Hey, love you, man. Get back to fighting those fires, bro.
You too. New Springs, miss you guys. Gav, man, always love, buddy.
Yeah, man. I'll see you, bro.